I never expected that a burst pipe and a ruined ceiling would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when my landlord sent over a contractor to fix the damage. He was the kind of guy I'd only ever admired from a safe distance, and I figured he was just there to measure studs, patch drywall, and leave. I had no idea he'd end up measuring the exact dimensions of my world before turning it completely upside down. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28 and had carved out a quiet, predictable life for myself as a freelance graphic designer. My world was mostly contained within the four walls of my second-floor apartment, a cozy space filled with books, half-finished sketches, and the constant, low hum of my computer. It was a life built on routine. Coffee at 7, work until noon, a short walk, then back to the screen until the evening light turned to soft, hazy gold outside my window. It was safe. It was controlled. And, if I was being honest with myself, it was a little lonely. The building was an old brick walk-up, the kind with charming imperfections that landlords like to call character. It had settled into a comfortable groan, and I knew its rhythms well. I knew the sound of Mrs. Gable's terrier scrabbling on the floor above me, and the precise time the mail carrier would shove letters through the slot in the lobby. My life was a collection of these small, familiar sounds and moments, a carefully composed symphony of solitude. I had seen him around before the leak, of course. Caleb. He was doing a gut renovation on the first-floor unit, and for a few weeks, the building's usual quiet was punctuated by the assertive buzz of a power saw or the rhythmic thud of a hammer. He was impossible not to notice. He had broad shoulders that strained against the fabric of his worn t-shirts, and his arms were dusted with a fine layer of sawdust that caught the light. His hair was a dark, unruly mess that he was constantly pushing off his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. He looked like every cliché of a rugged, straight contractor rolled into one distractingly handsome package. He moved with a purpose and confidence that I, a man who spent his days debating the merits of different shades of beige, found both intimidating and fascinating. Our interactions were limited to polite nods in the hallway, a brief morning exchanged as I headed out for my walk, and he carried in a new load of lumber. In my mind, he existed in a different universe, a universe of tangible things, of sweat and strength and sawdust. I was in a world of pixels and Pantone colors. He built walls. I chose the color to paint them. We were two different species, and I was content to observe him from my self-imposed enclosure, cataloging the small details, the way he smiled at Mrs. Gable, the focused set of his jaw when he was measuring something. As if I were a naturalist studying a rare and beautiful creature I knew I could never get close to. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You build these sturdy walls around your heart, convinced you know exactly how the world operates and your place within it. You tell yourself that certain people, certain feelings, are simply not meant for you. And then, one rainy Tuesday, a pipe in the apartment above you decides to burst, and all those carefully constructed walls come crashing down. Or, in my case, they just get really, really water damaged. The inciting incident, the moment my predictable world began to tilt on its axis, started with a single drop of water. It landed on my sketchbook with a soft plink, smudging a charcoal drawing I'd been working on for hours. I looked up, annoyed, and saw another drop forming on the ceiling, swelling like a tear before letting go. Then another, and another. Within minutes, a dark, ominous stain was spreading across the plaster, and the gentle plinking had become a steady, miserable drip. I spent the next hour in a frantic ballet of buckets and towels, trying to contain the deluge. My landlord, a man whose primary mode of communication was a long, weary sigh, promised to send his best guy over first thing in the morning. I didn't have to ask who it was. There was only one guy who worked on this building with any regularity. Caleb. The thought sent a nervous jolt through me that had nothing to do with the ruined ceiling. The next morning, my doorbell rang at precisely 8 o'clock. I opened it to find him standing there, and he seemed even bigger and more solid up close than he did in the hallway. He wore a gray Henley that fit him perfectly, and his hair was still damp from a shower. He smelled faintly of soap and sawdust, a combination I found utterly disarming. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Landlord sent me about a leak." I nodded, my own voice feeling thin and reedy in comparison. "Yeah, come on in. It's It's a bit of a mess. I stepped aside, gesturing him into my living room, suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The stack of art books on the coffee table, the half-empty mug by my computer, the general state of my life on display for this man who built things for a living. I felt like he could probably take one look at my apartment and know everything about my structural integrity or lack thereof. He walked into the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling, his expression serious and focused. He didn't seem to notice my clutter or my anxiety. He just saw the problem. He ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment, I was completely captivated by the simple, unconscious gesture. "Yep, that's a problem," he said, stating the obvious with a calm authority that I found incredibly reassuring. "Looks like the pipe to their shower head finally gave up. We'll have to cut out this whole section of drywall, let it air out for a few days, and then patch it all back up." I echoed, my brain catching on that one single word. My heart did a strange little flutter. He was going to be here, not just for an hour, but for days. In my space, in my quiet, controlled world. He glanced at me, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, as if he caught the slip. "I mean, I'll have to," he corrected himself. "It's going to be a bit noisy and dusty for a little while. I'll do my best to keep the mess contained." He looked around my living room, his eyes finally taking in the space. He gestured toward my workstation, where my large monitor displayed the branding package I was working on. "You work from home?" I nodded, feeling the need to explain my entire existence. "Graphic design. So yeah, I'm here. A lot." I managed a weak, self-deprecating smile. "Cool," he said, and it sounded genuine. He walked over and looked at the screen for a second. "That's intricate work. You must have a lot of patience." He turned back to me, his gaze direct and clear. For the first time, our interaction felt like more than just a polite exchange between neighbors. It felt like the beginning of a conversation. A very, very long conversation that would be happening inside my apartment for the foreseeable future. The thought was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. The work began that afternoon. Caleb was meticulous, laying down thick plastic sheeting over my floors and furniture with a surprising gentleness. He taped the edges down with crisp, straight lines, creating a quarantine zone around the damaged area. It was strange, watching this powerful man perform such delicate, considerate actions in my home. Every image I had of the loud, careless construction worker was being systematically dismantled before my eyes. He worked with a quiet efficiency that I admired. The sounds that filled my apartment were no longer random construction noises from another floor. They were specific, close, and somehow intimate. The scrape of his utility knife scoring the drywall, the low whir of his drill, the soft thud of a piece of damaged plaster being carefully removed. I tried to focus on my work, but my attention kept drifting to him. I watched the muscles in his back shift as he worked on a ladder. I listened to the soft rhythm of his breathing in the quiet moments between tasks. On the second day, he brought a small radio and tuned it to a classic rock station, keeping the volume low. It was a thoughtful gesture, a way of filling the otherwise awkward silence without being intrusive. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. I would work at my desk, and he would work on the ceiling. Every so often, he'd ask a question. "Do you mind if I use the outlet over here? Or is the music too loud?" I found myself looking for excuses to talk to him. I offered him a coffee, which he accepted with a grateful smile that made my stomach do a little flip. He took it black, of course. As he sipped it, he leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at some of the prints I had framed on the wall. They were my own designs, mostly abstract geometric patterns. "You do this stuff too?" he asked. "Just for fun," I said, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "It's different from the corporate stuff. More freedom, you know." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on a particularly complex black and white print. "I get that," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's good to have something you do just for yourself." He looked back at me, and there was a flicker of something in his expression, something thoughtful and a little wistful. "I wanted to be an architect once." That surprised me. I had him pegged so completely in one category, and here he was, casually revealing a piece of himself that didn't fit my preconceived notion at all. "Really? What happened?" I asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged, taking another sip of coffee. "Life, I guess. My dad got sick right after I finished high school, and his business was a contracting company. It was just me and him. So I stepped in to help, and I just never stepped back out." He said it without a trace of self-pity, just a simple statement of fact. But I could hear the ghost of a different life in his words. It was the first crack I'd seen in his confident, self-assured exterior. It was a glimpse of a vulnerability that made him seem suddenly, breathtakingly real. Later that afternoon, a moment happened that was so small, so insignificant, that I'm almost embarrassed to admit how many times I replayed it in my head. He was packing up for the day, and a cloud of fine white dust puffed up as he folded one of the plastic sheets. Some of it settled on my dark t-shirt. "Oh, sorry man," he said, stepping closer. Before I could say it was nothing, he reached out and brushed the dust from my shoulder with his hand. His touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. His fingers were warm and calloused, a stark contrast to the softness of my shirt. The touch lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. He pulled his hand back quickly, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second too long. "Got it," he said, his voice a little strained. He cleared his throat and went back to his work, but the space between us was suddenly charged with a new, unspoken energy. My shoulder tingled where he had touched it, and I stood there, motionless, long after he had gone, feeling the phantom warmth of his hand. The days that followed were a strange mix of domestic comfort and simmering tension. The hole in my ceiling was slowly shrinking as Caleb worked his magic. First came the fans, humming day and night to dry out the joists. Then the new piece of drywall, cut with surgical precision and screwed into place. He was an artist in his own way, and I found myself mesmerized by the sureness of his hands. Our conversations grew longer, more personal. He told me about growing up in the city, about his dad's love for old buildings, about the frustration and satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. I told him about my work, about the challenge of translating a company's entire identity into a single logo, about my dream of one day illustrating a children's book. We were mapping the edges of each other's lives, finding unexpected points of connection. He started staying a little later each day, stretching out the work. I knew he was. A 5-minute task would turn into a 15-minute conversation. He'd ask to see what I was working on, leaning over my shoulder to look at my screen. His proximity was electric. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint scent of wood and sweat that clung to his clothes. I lived for those moments, my entire day reorienting itself around them. The project was nearing its end. The drywall was patched, sanded, and primed. All that was left was the final coat of paint. It was a Thursday evening, and the sky outside was turning a deep, bruised purple. Caleb had said he just wanted to finish one last measurement to make sure everything was perfectly flush before he painted the next day. I was standing nearby, watching him, making a poor attempt at reading a book. The air was thick with the smell of primer and an unspoken anticipation. The radio was off, and the only sounds were the soft whir of the city outside and the slide of his metal tape measure. He worked with a focused silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. He measured the length of the new patch, then the width, jotting down the numbers in a small, beat-up notebook. He muttered to himself, checking the studs behind the wall one last time. I must have made some sound, a sigh or a shift in my weight, because he stopped and looked over at me. A slow smile spread across his face, and it was different from his usual friendly smiles. This one was playful, a little mischievous. "You're pretty quiet over there," he said, his voice low in the still room. I laughed, a nervous, breathy sound. Just trying to stay out of the way of the expert, I made a self-deprecating gesture down at my own body. I'm not exactly built for this kind of work. My structural integrity is questionable at best. It was a stupid, throwaway line, but it hung in the air between us. He looked at me, his gaze lingering. He was still holding the tape measure, the metal ribbon extended. He took a step toward me, then another. My heart started to pound against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking until he was standing right in front of me, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Let's see about that," he whispered. And then he did the thing that shattered my carefully constructed world into a million glittering pieces. He raised the tape measure, not to the wall, but to me. He hooked the metal end on my side and smoothly, expertly, wrapped it around my waist. The cold, thin metal was a startling contrast to the sudden heat that flooded my body. My breath hitched. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the tape measure cinching around my waist and the impossible closeness of him. His knuckles brushed against my stomach as he held the tape in place. But it was his other hand that undid me. He didn't just let the tape rest there. He placed his free hand on my other hip, his thumb pressing gently into the small of my back, as if to steady me, to hold me. His hands, they weren't measuring. They were holding. His large, warm, capable hands were on my waist, pulling me ever so slightly closer. He looked down at the number on the tape, then his eyes lifted to meet mine. The playful look was gone, replaced by something intense and questioning. We stood there for what felt like a lifetime, caught in a bubble of silent, charged air. The only thing I could hear was the frantic, desperate beat of my own heart. He slowly let the tape measure retract with a soft metallic shing, but his hands remained on my hips, burning impressions into my skin through the fabric of my shirt. He cleared his throat, and his hands dropped away from me as if they'd been burned. The sudden loss of contact left me feeling cold and dizzy. He took a step back, breaking the spell, and the air rushed back into my lungs. 31, he said, his voice rough. Solid enough. He turned away from me quickly and started packing his tools with jerky, abrupt movements, his back ramrod straight. I just stood there, my mind a complete blank. What had just happened? Was that a joke? A clumsy, bizarre attempt at flirting? Or had I imagined the whole thing, the intensity in his eyes, the possessive pressure of his hands? My waist still tingled where he'd held me. I could feel the ghost of his touch, a phantom brand on my skin. He didn't look at me again before he left, just muttered a clipped "see you tomorrow" as he walked out the door, leaving me alone in the deafening silence of my apartment with a perfectly patched wall and a heart in absolute chaos. The next 24 hours were a special kind of hell. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned, replaying the moment over and over in my mind, dissecting it from every conceivable angle. 1 minute, I was convinced it was a clear signal, a bold and undeniable move. His eyes, the way he held me, no one does that as a joke, right? It was a bridge he had built between his world and mine, a tangible, physical gesture that said everything he hadn't spoken aloud. Hope would surge through me, bright and dizzying. But then, doubt would creep in, a cold and insidious shadow. Maybe it was just a joke, a stupid, guyish thing to do. He was a contractor, a guy's guy. Maybe he was just messing with me, the quiet, artsy guy in the apartment. The thought made my stomach clench with a shame so intense it was nauseating. What if I had misread everything? What if I had projected all my own longing onto a series of simple, friendly interactions and one bizarrely intimate, but ultimately meaningless, gesture? I was terrified that when he returned, he would be laughing about it, or worse, acting as if it never happened, confirming it was nothing. When he arrived the next day to apply the final coat of paint, the atmosphere was thick with a new, suffocating awkwardness. The easy banter we had developed was gone, replaced by a stilted, painful silence. He was all business, his movements precise and professional, avoiding my eyes at all costs. He set up his paint tray and rollers without a word. The comfortable domesticity of the previous days completely evaporated. I tried to act normal, retreating to my desk and pretending to be absorbed in my work. But I couldn't focus. Every roll of the paint brush on the wall sounded like an accusation. The silence between us was a living thing, expanding and pressing in on me from all sides. I was caught in a miserable limbo, suspended between the hope of what that moment could have meant and the crushing fear that it had meant nothing at all. He was right there, just a few feet away, but he felt more distant than he had when he was just the handsome stranger working on another floor. My internal monologue was a frantic, looping argument. Say something, one part of me screamed. Just ask him what that was about. But the other, more cautious part of me, the part that had governed my life for so long, held me back. What if you're wrong? You'll make it weird. You'll ruin this fragile connection you've built. You'll just be the guy with the leaky ceiling who made a fool of himself. And so I said nothing, hiding behind my monitor, my anxiety a tight, burning knot in my chest. The distance between hope and fear felt like an uncrossable chasm, and I was stranded right in the middle of it. He finished painting in the late afternoon. The wall was perfect, seamless. It was as if the damage had never happened. He cleaned his brushes in my kitchen sink, his movements still clipped and efficient. The finality of his actions was terrifying. He was packing up. He was leaving. This strange, intense interlude in my life was over, and if I didn't say something, I would never know. The silence would be my answer. He gathered his tools, placing them carefully into a large canvas bag. The sound of the metal clinking together was like a countdown. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was now or never. I took a deep breath, ready to say his name, ready to risk everything. But before I could get a single word out, he spoke, his back still to me. Lucas, my name, on his lips, sounded both foreign and familiar. He stopped what he was doing, but didn't turn around. Look, about last night, his voice was low and strained. My blood ran cold. This was it. The apology, that it was just a joke, the dismissal. I braced myself. He finally turned to face me, and his expression was not what I expected. It wasn't amused or dismissive. It was nervous. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, his gaze shifting to the floor, to the newly painted wall, to anywhere but me. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he said, stumbling over the words. That was weird of me. It was unprofessional, and I wanted to apologize. My mind was racing. This wasn't the brush-off I had feared. This was an apology born of anxiety, not mockery. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to unfurl in my chest. You didn't make me uncomfortable, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The words were out before I could stop them. His eyes finally snapped to mine, wide with surprise. No, he asked, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. I shook my head, feeling a sudden surge of courage. I had nothing left to lose. No, I was just surprised. He let out a long breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had come to know so well. Okay, he said, mostly to himself. Okay, good. He looked at me, and this time, his gaze was direct, vulnerable, and completely open. The thing is, Lucas, it wasn't a joke. I mean, it was stupid, and I shouldn't have done it, but it wasn't a joke. He took a step closer, closing half the distance between us. I've seen you around the building for months, he confessed, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more earnest. I kept trying to think of a way to talk to you, a real conversation, not just mourning in the hall. And then this job came up, and it felt like, I don't know, a sign, or something. He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. And I got to spend time here, with you, and it was even better than I'd imagined. And last night, I just got carried away. It was a clumsy, stupid way to try and see what? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. If maybe you felt it too, he said, his eyes searching mine for an answer. This thing between us, or if I was just completely crazy. All the air left my body in a rush. It was real. It wasn't in my head. I took a step toward him, closing the remaining distance. We were standing as close as we had the night before, but this time, there was no tape measure, no pretense. Just a raw, terrifying, beautiful honesty. You're not crazy, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I felt it. I felt it since the day you started working here. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Caleb's face, transforming his entire expression. It was a smile of pure relief and joy, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the air between us before he gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The calloused skin was a comforting, solid reality. Yeah, he whispered. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. Yeah, I breathed. And then he kissed me. It was nothing like the hesitant, questioning touch of the night before. This was a kiss that was sure of itself, a kiss that had been held back for weeks. It was firm and soft, and tasted faintly of coffee and paint and hope. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and he wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me slightly off the ground. He held me there, securely, as if I was something precious he had finally found, and I held on to him as if I was afraid he might disappear. In the middle of my living room, with the smell of fresh paint in the air, everything finally made sense. The weeks that followed the kiss felt like waking up from a long, grayscale dream into a world of vibrant color. The apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, became our space. The awkwardness was replaced by an easy intimacy that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. Caleb would come over after work, still dusty and smelling of sawdust, and I would make us dinner. We would sit and talk for hours, filling in the sketches we had made of each other's lives with rich detail and shading. He was so much more than the man I had watched from my window. He had a surprisingly goofy sense of humor and a deep, abiding love for bad action movies from the 80s. I learned that he sketched blueprints of dream houses in his old notebook, the one he used for work, filling the pages with beautiful, impossible structures. He was a builder of dreams in more ways than one. In turn, I showed him my world. I showed him the frustrating process of designing a logo, the dozens of failed attempts that came before the final, perfect one. I read him passages from my favorite books. He listened with a genuine, quiet intensity that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. He saw the person behind the pixels, the heart behind the carefully chosen color palettes. With him, I didn't have to be the cautious, observant man in the apartment. I could just be Lucas. We spent our first real date wandering through the architectural salvage yard on the other side of town. He lit up there, running his hands over old wooden doors and stained glass windows, telling me the stories he imagined they held. He picked up a beautiful, heavy brass doorknob. "Every house needs a strong entrance," he said, looking at me. "Something solid to welcome you home." I knew he wasn't just talking about houses. A few months later, we were curled up on my sofa, the one he had so carefully covered in plastic. The wall was flawless, the memory of the leak all but gone. A movie was playing on the television, but neither of us was watching. I was tracing the lines on his calloused hand, marveling at how something so strong could be so gentle. He smiled down at me. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Just how weird it is," I said. "How all of this, us, started because of a disaster. A burst pipe and a ruined ceiling." He laughed, the sound warm and comforting. "It wasn't a disaster," he said, tightening his arm around me. "It was a renovation." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Sometimes you have to tear down a wall to see what's on the other side." He was right. For years, I had lived behind walls of my own making, walls of routine and caution and fear. I had convinced myself that this was all life was, a safe and predictable solitude. I never expected that the man who came to fix my home would end up rebuilding my entire world. But that's the funny thing about life. You can draw up all the plans you want, but sometimes the most beautiful structures are the ones you never saw coming, built on a foundation of unexpected connection and the courage to let someone in.